Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. This is the podcast where we explore the evolving maritime landscape and hear from innovators leading the charge. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Garry Noonan, Director of Innovation at Ardmore Shipping Company. For a company like Ardmore, a leader in the tanker product and chemical space, innovation can mean many things, from strategies to reducing emissions to navigating the digital landscape and transformation ship operations. We'll dive into Garry's role as Director of Innovation, what he's focused on today, and how he sees the future of Ardmore and the shipping industry at large. Garry, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and following in the footsteps of some incredible people on this podcast.
Well, thank you very much, and really excited to have you on and really to talk about kind of the first thing. You started off, and I think this is a super important thing. You started off with a career at sea, then moved ashore. And as you moved up the ranks, you're here leading innovation now at a publicly listed company. Let's talk about that journey a little bit, and let's talk about some of the changes that you've seen, because you've been doing this a couple of decades, and you've obviously seen a lot of things change, especially starting ashore to where you are today.
Yes, I mean, a quick background on my seagoing experience. I started as a cadet with BP, working up through pretty much every class of vessel they had, both motor and steam. Came ashore with Ardmore after 11 years with BP on the technical side of things as a superintendent. Then took over the fleet, moved on to technical manager. Done that for many years, and kind of my day-to-day job was the fleet, but the innovation and energy efficiency was kind of my side of my desk. And as the energy transition ramped up and we saw the horizon, it became more and more the center of my desk, and kind of gravitated towards that. I'm interested in that field. I love the new technologies and where it's going, and seeing what we can do with it and how we can use it in different ways. So it kind of became more and more of my day job. And then we kind of decided internally that we needed to dedicate a team to the energy transition plan. So we set up the innovation team, and we set up a cross-sectional or cross-departmental team, different people from across the company, which we call the energy transition plan team at the time. And, we wanted a diverse cross-section in that team, because the last thing we wanted was, 10 marine engineers sitting in the room all having the same idea. When I was on ships, I was a big fan of, the best idea can come from the cadet. Sometimes not knowing what you don't know is the precursor to make those comments. Someone else might think it's a stupid comment, but, through new eyes, it comes out and it can be revolutionary without even knowing what you're talking about. So we want to have a cross-section of people that look at different problems, different ways, so that we have that, diversity of thought in the room, but also diversity of educational background, so that I wouldn't be looking at something in the same way a lawyer would, the same way a human resources person would. So to have that diversity was something we thought was paramount to the team, and it's paid massive dividends. When I think back to from the start of my career, even to the end of my career at sea, it was chalk and cheese even then. And I would have been, at the time, the new guard, and I still have this kind of, I suppose, thought in my head that I'm still young, I'm the new guy.
I think the same way. I mean, and I remember having one of those cadet experiences. I was a cadet observer on an MSC, Military Seals Command ship, and they loaded this was in 1991. Okay, so I'm dating myself. They loaded it looked like an RV we were told it was the State Department in Virginia, and then we did a transatlantic crossing, and then we were in Rota, Spain. And I remember this like it was yesterday. We were in Rota, Spain. We had to get it off, and it was for the State Department ahead of the 1992 World's Fair that they were holding in Cadiz. I think there was something going on, or maybe it was an Olympics. It was 92 Olympics in Barcelona. Anyway, there was something going on. They needed this van there, and they couldn't figure out how to get it off. It was an oiler. It was an oiler ships, but it had, because it was military, it had like a hangar deck, which is where they stored the van. So they put the van, they ended up trying to put slings underneath it, and it was going to break the whole thing. And I said, why don't you take the truck that you're going to lift, like the flatbed part of the truck that you're actually going to put it on, put that onto the ship, drive the thing on, and then lift the. And the captain looked at me like, they were doing this for 3 hours. He goes, why didn't you just look at, you go, yeah, do that. It was off. But I think more to your point, the diversity of having different eyes. And I think one of the interesting things you talk about is you have marine people, but then having non-marine people also in those groups are super important, because that's what I've been an advocate for. I feel that especially on the digital side of things, so many people have good ideas. They come from outside the industry. They think they could solve the problems by sitting in on a meeting or having a focus group, but really you need to have that think to have the right maritime folks. But I've always advocated you can't have too many. You have to have that balance.
And definitely, and one of my team members has recently joined. He's a machine learning specialist, worked with Apple back in the day. He doesn't know shipping, but he speaks a different language to us. And that's something we wanted. We didn't want someone that can do what I can do. We needed someone that can do something, completely different. That is exactly what we wanted from it. And I was kind of saying there, like when I started my career to, my seagoing time to the end of it, even that was astronomically different in the way things happen. We had a lot of legislation come in. Control of work was fairly new when I joined, and it changed shipping quite a lot. And I always said being a marine engineer to me is the best job in the world if I could go home for my dinner. And it's kind of, as you kind of go through life and start having family, that's when people have to make that tough decision. For me, it was right, I need to come ashore, and started working with Ardmore. And it was revolutionary for me because I came from BP, which I would have thought at the time was a top of the range company. We were still on noon reports.
Yeah.
I came to, and to be honest, not too many people cared about fuel consumption as long as it wasn't implausible or, you were leaking fuel somewhere, it was fine. And then I came to Ardmore, and the first thing I got handed was a report with high frequency data. And I was just like, oh, what is this? And I mean, even now, coming up on 10 and a half years with Ardmore, the change from back then to what we see now, it's gone through iterations. At the time, Jerry Doherty would have been my boss. He brought it so far. I brought it again. And then Suraj Batra, the new technical manager, has brought it another level. Yeah. Even that, just to have those fresh eyes building on what other people have done, has helped us really to build a performance monitoring platform. At the time, there was nothing available. And even now, because it's been a continuous work for us, there's nothing that we can find comparable out there that can do what we need it to do. And, we've had that symbiotic relationship with Albus Performance where we've asked them to do something and they've done it for us. So we've kind of built our systems together. So we kind of go hand in glove with them. It's just been incredible, the difference when I look back now from what we have today versus what we had back then. And then go back another 11 years before that, and it seems archaic now.
You're focusing a lot on emissions. You're focusing a lot on performance. Kind of what are your big challenges? Is it just kind of keeping up with all the rules right now? What kind of keeps you up at night? Or you said the best job in the world is a marine engineer, that I could go home at night. So you go home at night, you stay in your bed. What kind of makes you toss and turn when it comes to kind of the innovation and moving forward here?
I suppose innovation in itself is a double-edged sword. You get to look at all the new technologies, you get to play with the cool toys, you get to look ahead, but every day you go into a senior management meeting, it's what's the new thing, what's coming. And it is a lot of work to keep on top of multiple industries, because I'm a firm believer shipping is not going to progress into the future in the way it needs to, certainly around energy transition on its own. We're paving our path, certainly, but there's a lot of people have already done a lot of work in other areas. So I spent most of my career at sea, and even at the start of Ardmore, becoming more and more of a fine-tuned specialist. And now, since I'm in the innovation, I find myself becoming more and more of a generalist. I've attended conferences and something like that I never would have spoken about before, like hydrogen and different world future fuels. It really is a broad remit, but when I think of like what really does keep me up at night, I mean, it is the energy transition. And how are we going to get there? And obviously the IMO have come out through the MEPC with a roadmap that hopefully will be ratified by the end of the year. But again, I don't see any of the future fuels ticking the box for what we need right now. So I think we still need a lot of work done in research and development, because I don't think anything we have right now is fit for purpose. Everything is going to be a compromise compared to hydrocarbons that we have today. Yeah. So it's kind of trying to keep a finger on many pulses. It's never that easy, but I think we're lucky, and we have the internal team, which is now called the Ardmore Innovation Research Team, because we've changed it from the Energy Transition Plan team to incorporate the bigger remit of AI, digitalization, and energy transition. It's not just one or two people looking at different fields. We have 15 people now that spend a lot of their time, and even our own internal metrics are how do we see engagement across the company? Not just the people that do this day to day. How do people look at outside their day to day roles? What are they bringing to the table? Because trying to create an innovative culture is quite difficult. It's something you need to kind of keep pushing and pressing and putting at the forefront of people's minds till it becomes muscle memory.
In the background or working in the environment of maritime shipping, right? Tongue in cheek, we are the last dinosaur, ha ha ha. There is that mindset shift, which I think over time, if you have leadership and having a group of 15 people looking at it, and not just two folks who also does 7 other things, which I would imagine that's maybe the starting point of a lot of companies, where it just starts off and then management will say, hey, we really need to focus on that. That's certainly important. Talk a little bit about the digitalization side, because I would imagine that you guys are really inundated with all these different solutions in and around, whether it's emissions, whether it's efficiency, workflow efficiencies, or what have you, that you kind of have to look at. There may be a better solution out there, but then at what cost to disrupting what you have? And okay, the new solution's out there this year, but 18 months, there's even a better solution. At what point do you kind of pull the trigger or pull back or try to figure out, what works best for the entire org? Yeah,
and I'm glad you brought up the name of the show, because I think sometimes we can use it as a crutch. Oh, we're the last dinosaurs. It's a nice way of saying don't bother us. Everything we do from there on in is great, because if you expect nothing.
Yeah. Lower those bars. Lower that bar. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think certainly from my perspective, that is not the industry I work in. It's when I'm out there, you talk about digitalization. There's not a day I don't get at least 3 or 4 emails for a brand new software as a service system. And unfortunately, the technology readiness level probably isn't there for a lot of them. And the startup landscape can be quite difficult, especially now. I think the energy transition is probably coming off the top of a hype cycle. We're maybe in a little bit of a trough. So funding isn't as readily available as it probably was. What we find an awful lot is startups get funded to fix a specific problem. And shipping, like Ardmore, is a niche company in a niche sector, in a niche industry, that no one knows very much about. So, when you get down to the intricacies of it, our problems are very, very much our problems. They might not be the exact same as another product or chemical tanker companies. So, trying to find something, a one-stop shop for you, is nigh on impossible. So what we kind of pride ourselves on is, cherry picking different products and connecting them in ways that, they would not have been designed to be. And, trying to get synergies through that kind of connection. So again, you bring up the thing, like, when do you make that choice and how do you make that choice? And I always use the analogy, if you wait for the best technology, take iPhones for instance, if you waited for next year's, you'll never actually make a decision. And, when it comes to the energy transition, the ton of carbon you save today is worth, a whole lot more than a ton of carbon in 10 years' time. So, sometimes you just need to make a decision, and something we're very comfortable with is failing. Make a decision, fail fast if you're going to fail.
Yeah.
And, I think back to the old NASA adage of, failure is not an option. And I think, things have moved on right now that failure has to be an option, because if you're not failing, you're not innovating hard enough. And, it's something we very much take to, if we have a project that doesn't work, no, it's not a witch hunt. It's, dissect it, what happened, why did it not happen, learn from it,
Right.
move on. And, I think that's kind of our culture, and we're not afraid to take calculated risks. And I think that's what shipping is in my mind. Shipping is risk management.
Yeah, the whole thing is whether it's operational management, counterparty risk management, so on, and now it's this other level of technology risk management, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to start to think about what's going to be the best solution, maybe not for the next 5 years, maybe even just for the next 12 to 18 to 24 months, and then you could recalibrate. And I think what you talk about is kind of putting together platforms or features of platforms that becomes part of the whole is definitely the idea, because that is one thing kind of I alluded to at the beginning, is that you have somebody who's trying to solve a singular problem and they have this grand idea, but what they don't understand is that problem is one of many that a ship owner, charterer, manager, broker, agent, whoever the target is, has to solve, right? And that becomes, they have to realize that that's part of the bigger problem, because what I do think it's going to lend to is some consolidation. We've seen it already in certain things. We've seen it a little bit more recently in the satellite hardware space. We've seen it with companies like my former employer, Veson, buying a few firms and trying to consolidate what they can there, and others, right? So it certainly is interesting. Maybe putting you on the spot a little bit, do you guys ever look to invest in these companies, or is it just simply an arm's length, you'll purchase it or maybe be an active user of it? Is that something that from an innovation point of view that you would look to get involved on the investing side, or that's kind of outside the scope?
That would be really outside our scope. I mean, at the end of the day, we're a shipping company, and that's where our expertise are, and we very much want to stay within our field. That being said, we do speak with companies, we do help them come along, and we're more than happy to work with companies to build a product with the end goal being that it suits us. Yeah, I mean, we're not venture capitalists by any stretch.
No, the reason for my question was more as you built your kind of innovation studio and kind of got away from the emissions and more general innovation, is that you're seeing that with a lot of shipping companies, more private than public, but certainly they start to almost spin off a whole separate entity where all they do is becomes a venture capital, and I know a lot of companies are looking to live somewhere in the middle of that, kind of what you're doing, which I think is a super important part of the business and moving forward.
And look, I mean, our goal has always been, and from day one, energy efficiency has been our remit. Saving fuel has never been bad for business. Our goal is always make our assets better, make our processes more efficient, but with the goal of let's do more with what we have. And our shareholders have invested in a shipping company, and that's what we want to be. But that doesn't mean we're pigeonholed into just day-to-day running. As I said, and it's funny, I had a conversation last week at a conference, and I said to someone that the amount of times I've said we've run out of low-hanging fruit is actually frightening. And there always seems, just as you kind of feel that there's nothing left, something else comes out from left field, and okay, that's another project. And
Yeah.
Obviously, energy efficiency is eventually going to lead to diminishing returns. We are seeing new innovative things coming online that we wouldn't have even dreamed of before. That is amazing. Necessity is the mother of all invention, right?
Yeah.
When you feel like
absolutely. And like you said, and I heard Bart Kelleher, who's your CFO, saying the same thing, that, saving fuel never goes out of style, and it is basically helps the bottom line. So that's always a good thing.
And I mean, when you look at the energy transition, as I said, nothing is going to be as cheap or as fuel energy dense as hydrocarbons. So energy efficiency is going to be exponentially more important, and kind of you can get caught up in what is the future fuel, what fuel are you going to use. Right now we don't know where they're going to be available, what's going to be available. Shipping doesn't operate in a vacuum. We're a very small percentage of the global energy demand, so we probably won't be masters of our own destiny. The fuel we'll use is probably the one that's going to be available, but I do know that fuel is going to be more expensive, and that's why everything we do now, and even if it doesn't fit the vessels we have right now because of their age profile, we're storing that. We're constantly revisiting those because eventually we will be coming into newer vessels, and we want to make sure that you have everything lined up because there's so few opportunities to upgrade a vessel. Realistically, if you're operating a vessel within the 15 years that kind of seem to be dictated by the oil majors, you get 2 proper opportunities once it's delivered, the first special and the second special, so you've 5 years in between them. So if you miss that slot, it's another 5 years before you get a chance to put it on that vessel. So you want to have everything there. So even though we would say our hit rate, I think the last time I checked it, we had over 200 technologies reviewed, and I think 15 doesn't sound like a great hit rate. We have a store of data that we understand what we can and can't do. I can guarantee you if we build new vessels, there'll be a lot more than that 15 that we've executed on those, because every technology we put on has to stand on its own 2 legs. And if you have 15 years, it gives you a lot better chance to get your money back than if it was 5 years.
5 years, yeah.
With a lot of our vessels. There's always that kind of fear that you have run out, but we always seem to just turn that corner and then there's another light.
It reminds me of when I first started doing the podcast. I was like, all right, well, how many? I'll just have a couple of CEOs of new companies, and who else? Maybe I'll get this guy, that guy, and then you would be surprised how many people, and I'm very blessed on this, that just, I don't say no to necessarily right away, but I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of booked until next year. And they look at me like, next year? Like, no. And I'm like, all of a sudden people come out, and some ideas are really great that I like, and some are, let me see how I think about it, how it fits in. But it's all around digitalization or social media and using kind of new tools and kind of getting us further away from the dinosaur age. You brought up something interesting, emissions. We talk a lot about emissions on this podcast, but ultimately it comes down to the seafarers. Talk about your role and bridging that kind of innovative mindset to the role of the folks working on your ship, because that's really where, as an engineer, sorry, I was just a decky, but even as a decky, we have to, have the burden of operating the ship correctly, operating the ship most fuel efficient, all these things that, it's the rubber hits the road for the impact, for what you're going to report to your shareholders and to the respective authorities.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, you touch on a really important point there. There's no point in putting the technology on board if it's not going to be utilized. It just becomes really expensive paperweight. We try to gravitate to passive technologies where we can, like PBCFs, Mevis ducts, hull coatings. It doesn't put a burden on the seafarer, but ultimately we will have systems that do put a burden on the seafarers, and we try to minimize that. But I think, you need to build that culture internally, and that is not an easy thing. But I think you have to bring the seafarers with you on the journey. And you talk about change even from my day to now. When we first got Fleet Free, I could log into my emails, go do my rounds, come back up, and it might have opened the webpage. Now the guys have Starlink on board. That has enabled us to have Teams calls with the vessel. So, when you are rolling something out, you can have the guys that designed it sitting there explaining it. But ultimately, you need to bring the seafarers with you on the journey. At the end of the day, we're there to help them, not the other way around. They're the guys. Without ships, there's no shipping company. And I think sometimes we can forget that. The guys at sea that are the ones that make the massive difference. We can only do so much, but they're the ones that execute it. And if you explain to them why you're doing it and how it works, and feedback loop, because sometimes you see, and certainly in my day, a lot of information went into the office and it was like a black hole. You never understood why they were asking for it or what they'd done with it. which is why we feed back all the ship's performance to the guys on board, let them understand what it does, how it's happening, and how it affects our TCE rate even, so that they understand that this is actually affecting the company. We explain to them all the time, we believe performance is our ticket to trade. It's our differentiator. It's what keeps us alive. So, explaining to the guys what it is and how it works, and listening to their I suppose, concerns, their queries, not dismissing them. But ultimately, it comes down to repetition a lot of times. Because guys come, guys leave, they pay off, they go home, new guys join, not everything gets transferred. So a lot of it is trying to build that. And, one thing we're very lucky with that we have for the last, I can't remember exactly how many years, but we have a joint venture with Anglo-Eastern called Noonan of Ardmore, which has allowed us to ring fence a pool of seafarers so that we have the same guys coming back. We have an incredible retention rate in the high 90s. So we know the guys, you build that relationship, you go to sea staff conferences, you talk to them, you explain why you're doing things, the logic behind it. And, then they understand the why. And if you sell them the why, it makes it a lot easier than just telling them what to do. And it also gives them the conduit to feedback ideas that you might not have thought of. Because, even though we say there's 15 of us in the office looking at this, we have hundreds and hundreds of seafarers, and we want them to, not walk past the problem, to tell us a problem. I mean, every now and again at a conference, I'll throw the question, if money was no option, what would you do? Just to see the fanciful things that people, because then I think you get to the crux of what are the actual issues you're facing, rather than, someone sitting there going, well, they'll never do this because it's going to cost too much.
Right. And so maybe there is something out there that you were looking at that marginally that's more expensive, but we've had 3 people now say that could be a really good idea. So yeah, it may be more expensive up front, but is this going to save us efficiency? Is this going to save us on retention? It's going to have a hidden cost, somewhere down the road that it makes it equal to or better than the other alternative, which may be lower costs, right? So that's always great to get that feedback. Again, different viewpoints can only be helpful, I think, in this sort of situation.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the areas we're heavily focused on now is trying to utilize AI to increase efficiencies in the office. And by the office, I also mean the chief's office and the captain's office. We have full teams of highly qualified seafarers, and a lot of times they're doing mundane paperwork. I want captains to go back to sailing their ships and chief engineers to go back to operating their plant, not writing emails. So we're looking to see how we can leverage AI. We've rolled out Copilot in the office, and now we're trying to see if we can get it on board, because, it's all about reducing that time, getting people away from the grind, because when you remove those repetitive, mundane tasks, you give people time to breathe, but that time can be spent on high value thoughts and thinking and looking at processes with a view of how can we make this more efficient. If you're blinkered into a process, it's very hard to understand how you can make it better. Whereas if you have a chance to take a step back, and that for us is what we see as the key to AI. It's not about reducing people anywhere. It's about giving people time to have high value thought processes, rather than sitting there, pardon the phrase, head down, bum up, just grind.
Once you train an AI worker can do it, and never to remove the seafarer or the person is, I just think there's so much additive that can focus on what a captain told me once a long time ago is after the third mate, I was cadet on board, was kind of had their head in the radar, and he's like, no, the truth is out the window. And more of that, okay, you got your information, you got 3 targets, one's probably going to be a pain. You don't need to study it because there's nothing to study. Go look out the window because you'll see the action before it comes through on radar. And you kind of have to do both. And I think that's where I look at the evolution of AI and going back to, I don't think it's going to replace shipbrokers. I think shipbrokers and the chartering staff who use it and embrace it will be in a better spot than others, and that gap will just become bigger and bigger. One of the things that you look back on your career and as you start to hire different people and you need to compete against, you said you had somebody on the AI side of things who's ex-Apple or what have you. How do you get them to come join the dark side of maritime? Like I tell people, come to the dark side. We have cookies or maybe beer to go into our reputation. What do you tell people? You know, maybe they're considering going into more of a traditional technology company or aerospace or what have you. But you say, no. You know, what do you do to convince them to come and whether it's to join Ardmore or a career in shipping? It doesn't have to be at sea. It could be in some of the stuff that you're working on now.
I say this to the guys at sea, and I think we're very guilty of this. When you go to sea as a seafarer, it's like, you know, for an engineer, your path is, oh, you're going to become a chief engineer. There's such a wide world in shipping. I mean, I knew so little about shipping on the ship. When I left the ship, I didn't realize how big it was. And, you know, it's an incredibly interesting industry. And, you know, you try and explain to people that, you're right, you're trying to break down the perception, you know, that it's archaic, but it's not. There's a lot going on here. I think just explaining to people what you're trying to do and how you're doing it. And, you know, one of the things years ago I would have said, if you weren't a forward-thinking company in terms of energy transition, you wouldn't have access to, let's say, the Gen Z talent pool. Now, I think it's going to be even worse with it. You're going to have kids in school now learning generative AI. You're going to have, you know, students in college coming out of college incredibly conversant in generative AI. And if they go to a company and they're like, well, now you don't have those tools, it's like taking Excel away from an accountant. And all of a sudden you're like, well, actually, I'm not going to go to work for you. So I think it's almost like, not only is it not going to be a competitive advantage in the future, I think it's going to be a necessity to get access to these people.
Yeah.
You know, I think the more people can explain how interesting an industry shipping is, because it's one of the very few actually global industries where, you know, you can sit down with 12 different cultures at a table and everyone needs to interact on a level. And I think that's just an amazing thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was doing a presentation in front of my 13-year-olds, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. I had a career day, and I just said it was right around when President Trump was announcing the tariffs. And I said, listen, I'm not going to make a commentary about it. It's not fair. It's not the place. But what I can tell you is that our industry will be the front lines for these tariffs. It's maritime shipping, whether it's the clothes on your back, whether it's the oil to make plastics or to go in your car, or the cars themselves. Somebody, someplace, a lot of somebodies and a lot of some places are going to be figuring out how to deal with it. Do you continue trade there? What's going to happen? What's the impact on the ships, the sailors, the pilots, the ship's pilots? All these different people are going to have impacts, and they're all going to study it. Again, I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying, if you think about what's going on in the news today, when you go home tonight, take a look at and think of it in the lens of what a career here is. Because pretty much everybody's going to have to deal with it in one way, shape, or another. And you can see the light bulbs go on a few 13, 14-year-olds. You know, it wasn't the coolest presentation, I'm sure, but it was good. It was interesting. I tried to relate to that, to those folks. Well, Garry, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it. It was great, fascinating conversation. Always love to hear where the rubber hits the road with innovation and seafarers and, you know, the folks that implement it. So thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it.